Okay, then the next speaker, Miss Clara Grillet. I hope I pronounced it the right way this time, but it's always an issue for me. But anyway, Clara is a dedicated cyber threat intelligence analyst at the Center for Cybersecurity Belgium. With her sharp analytical skills and keen eye for detail, Clara has been instrumental in uncovering and understanding the complex landscape of cyber threats. She has a knack for turning vast amounts of incident data into actionable insights, helping to paint a clearer picture of the Belgian cyber threat landscape. But one little story about Clara. The first time Clara presented at a CCB event, my phone was bombarded, DDoSed with messages from people asking where I had found that fantastic lady. It was like a DDoS attack, but instead of hackers, it was Clara's newfound fans. Ever since, her fan club has been growing exponentially, but don't worry, she's not going anywhere. You will understand why I'm saying this after you have seen her presentation. Today, Clara will share her findings on the spike in reported incidents during the first quarter of 2025. While this might sound alarming, Clara will explain this, or why this increase is actually a good thing. And remember, folks, in the world of cybersecurity, more data means more power. So let's give a warm welcome to Clara, who will show us how to turn chaos into clarity.
Well, thanks, Pedro. That's a very, very flattering introduction. For anybody who is just joining this QCTR, welcome. Really happy to have you there. I'm going to go ahead and share a couple of slides because we do actually have quite a lot of information to talk about today. So as you could guess from the title of today's presentation, Breaking Records and Not Alarms, we actually have a lot of information being sent to us. It's a lot of notifications, and let's just go ahead and jump right in before it triggers alarm bells in everybody's heads. So the first thing that we want to say is that when you're looking at the amount of information and of notifications that we receive, we simply have more and more coming in every year. So if you're looking at the data from 2022, 2023, and 2024, you would see that we keep receiving more and more incidents being reported to the CCB. So that's part of a general trend. However, what is really interesting about this past quarter is that the rate at which we're receiving more notifications is just staggering. So if you're taking the first 3 months of 2024 and comparing them with the first 3 months of this year, you would see an increase in the number of notifications of 57.5%, which is a pretty significant increase. You can ask us, our contact center, they would also tell you it's a lot of new work. So of course, in this wonderful team of analysts that we are, we've been asking ourselves the question, is Belgium more targeted, or is it simply that we have a better view? And spoiler alert, everyone, it's a little bit of both. So when I'm talking about a better view, a lot of you might be thinking about NIS2, because we all know NIS2 is sort of changing the game here in Belgium and in general in Europe. We do have to mention that if you're looking at the amount of notifications that we had before NIS2 entered into force in October last year, we averaged about 25 notifications a month. And then since NIS2, we are now averaging 45 notifications a month. So there is a NIS2 effect. However, it is too early for us to say to what extent the increase of notifications that I mentioned on the previous slide is due to NIS2 and how much of it is due to just simply more attacks or just in general more reporting. What is interesting beyond just the numbers is that whenever organizations report to us their cyber incidents, and they're linked to that with NIS2, they're giving us first notifications that something's happening, but also a couple of weeks later, they have to give us their instant response information. And that is truly valuable, because what might seem like an isolated incident to you, with all the data that we're gathering at the CCB, we're able to isolate patterns, but also sometimes detect ongoing campaigns as they are happening. So that really is the super valuable element of reporting. But now let's take a look at what's actually happening in Belgium. So if you're looking at the breakdown in terms of notifications, you would see basically a 40-60 split. So you'd have about 40% of incidents or notifications that are about attacks that can be quite different. You would have things such as brute force attacks and system compromise and phishing. So there are different kinds of attacks of which we have rather few occurrences. But for 60% of those notifications, these fit nicely into three categories. And these three categories are ransomware, account compromise, and DDoS attacks. So I just want to go ahead and focus a little bit more on what all of these things are telling us. So first of all, ransomware, it remains the most important threat in Belgium. And that was true in previous quarters, and that is still true today. Ransomware is the top threat in Belgium. Here again, we do see an increase in the number of ransomware incidents being reported. So we're looking at a 42.8% increase between same period last year and same period this year. Ransomware remains what we would call a persistent threat. And that is very true in Europe. That is also true in North America. If you're looking at the European context, Belgium is the 8th most targeted country. So that already gives you a bit of an idea of how targeted we may be. Ransomware fundamentally doesn't change in the nature that it has, which is opportunistic. In other words, ransomware groups typically do not target a specific organization, but they're seeing an opportunity and they're seizing it, which is right. Ransomware is a persistent threat for every sector and also companies of every size. If you want to narrow it down into what happened the first 3 months of this year, you would see that in Belgium, the three most targeted sectors were IT, wholesale, and retail. But if you're looking at previous quarters, you would also see other sectors being targeted. So it's not because you're not operating in IT, wholesale, or retail that you can rest on your laurels. Actually, quite the contrary. As with a lot of things when it comes to cyber attacks, preparedness is key. And so the impact of ransomware really ranges from low to high, depending on the organization's preparedness, including depending on the organization's ability to have and restore from backups. Once again, backups are great, but it's not a proper, viable solution against ransomware. One thing that I do want to mention as well is that we do see the effect of law enforcement actions. So whenever law enforcement comes and decides to dismantle or disrupt ransomware group activities, you would see that the ransomware affiliates, so the ones who really are targeting you and starting the attack, they would tend to shift from one group to the next. And so that's why we saw a little bit of lockbit at the very start of the year, but very soon there was law enforcement action. And so now the top 3 ransomware families that were observed in Belgium are Fog Ransomware, Ransom Hub, and also Akira. Now let us move on to DDoS attacks. So while ransomware is what we call a persistent threat that's always looming around, DDoS attacks are what we call periodic threats, which means that they're not always happening. So if you're looking at January and February in Belgium, we didn't really have a lot of DDoS attacks, but in March and April, we had a 2-week-long campaign called Up Belgium, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but this 2-week-long campaign was orchestrated and led by pro-Russian hacktivist groups. And namely, you had No Name 05716, I think Z-Pantas, Server Killers, and Sandworm, not the APT, the hacktivist groups. But this is not the only DDoS attacks that we see. There are other smaller kinds of DDoS attacks that see and pop up here and there, but these are unclaimed. So they are carried out by unknown threat actor groups. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about Up Belgium. So as I mentioned, this was a 2-week-long campaign that was launched by pro-Russian hacktivist groups in retaliation for an additional military aid package from Belgium to Ukraine. The way that they did it is that they decided to launch high-volume DDoS attacks, and they selected across those 2 weeks around 200 organizations in Belgium. And what is interesting there is not just the sheer number of organizations that were targeted, because 200 is quite a big number, but also that what you're looking at who was targeted, it would combine what we could call traditional victims, as in organizations that are in the government or the public administration sector. But you would also see a lot of organizations from unrelated sectors, such as maritime and banking, research. We had logistics, media, telecommunications. There's a lot of different sectors that were represented in those attacks. And for those of you who are NIS2 organizations, yes, NIS2 organizations were also among the victims of this particular 2-week-long campaign. Here, once again, preparedness is key. And so the impact of Operation Belgium was low to high. And that really depended on the organization's preparedness, but also on the proactive measures that were taken by the ISPs. So a big thank you to ISPs who decided to put in place anti-DDoS measures really quickly, because that had a massive impact. Now, one threat that we didn't talk about much in the past, but thankfully we had a very interesting presentation with Dmitry here. It's all about account compromise. And we're talking about a rising threat because up until the end of last year, we didn't have a lot of incidents being reported specifically about that. But starting the end of last year, we see more and more account compromise being reported to us. Once again, this is a question mark. Maybe there was a NIS2 effect, but it is too early for us to say to what extent there is one. And so account compromise really is a rising threat because of many different things. So one of the reasons is simply that people have more devices and they have more services that are being logged into. You also have, and Dmitry also showed you, an entire vast part of the underground market that is dedicated to leak credentials. And all too often, you also have a lot of services that are not yet protected by multi-factor authentication. And so all of this basically leads to more possibilities for account compromise. Dmitry also talked about MFA, how it's not the perfect protection, even though it is a pretty good protection. But what we do also see is that as defenders add additional security controls, such as multi-factor authentication, but not just that, attackers are going to find a way to create more sophisticated attacks in order to still be able to compromise systems. And we do want to talk about account compromise because it is not a trivial attack. It is not a trivial event. Actually, we consider that an account compromise is really the start of the kill chain. It is one of the ways that attackers can get in. It's usually one of the ways that they're going to be using for lateral movement. And so at the CCB, we're really trying our best to try to prevent that as proactively as possible. So to give you an idea, just in the first 3 months of this year, we sent in an alert, spear warning communications to organizations for more than 2,200 leaked credentials. And you might say, that's a fair number, but there's a lot of combo lists out there. Actually, we have some kind of filtering in place to really look at what is the freshest credentials. So it gives you an idea of just the extent of the threat of leaked credentials and account compromise in general. Of course, it wouldn't really be a threat landscape overview if I didn't talk about state-sponsored operations. So let's jump right in as well. In the first 3 months of this year, we saw a lot of activity from Chinese state-sponsored groups. And while we're mentioning the Chinese state-sponsored groups, it doesn't mean that other APTs were lying dormant. Not at all. They were remaining active as well. It's just in comparison, we didn't see as much activity from them. The goals of state-sponsored operations remain the same. You're still looking at espionage, including economic espionage. You're looking at surveillance and disinformation in general. What we observed in the first 3 months of this year is that the preferred initial access vector for state-sponsored operations were the exploitation of vulnerabilities, and in particular, vulnerabilities in Ivanti and Cisco devices that are at the periphery, so public-facing devices. We're not here to name and shame. We're just mentioning in this particular quarter, the preferred vulnerabilities for Ivanti and Cisco. So if this is typically the devices that you're using, please make sure that you are running the most updated version possible. And of course, if we do see state-sponsored operations, we're going to be taking action. So this is why the CCB, along with national, but also international partners, have been launching and working on investigations around especially known C2 malware, such as PlugX, which a lot of you know, is a custom malware that is typically shared among Chinese state-sponsored groups. Of course, I talked a little bit about vulnerabilities, and now is the information that is really key for you who are all working in vulnerability management. I do want to highlight a couple of key vulnerabilities in the past quarter. And when I talk about key vulnerabilities, I'm really talking about vulnerabilities that have a high CVSS score. So you're looking usually at high or critical rating, but also vulnerabilities that are either already under active exploitation or who are likely to be actively exploited. Now, I will not be able to talk about all of the different CVEs that are mentioned on this particular slide. If you recognize any one of those, please make sure that you have patched. But I do want to have just a minute on the first vulnerability mentioned on the slide, which is CVE 2025-0282. And that is a critical vulnerability in Ivanti Connect Secure in the VPN appliance. And what happened in this particular case is that Ivanti released a security advisory early January 2025, and they mentioned that it was already under active exploitation. And then you had a couple of additional articles that came out that were saying that this particular vulnerability has been exploited since December 2024, and that exploitation is linked to a Chinese group called UNC 5337. When we saw that vulnerability, knowing that it is from an Ivanti VPN and that it is actively exploited, at the CCB, we decided to take action really quickly. So we scanned the Belgian cyberspace and we noticed that there were 30 vulnerable devices. So right away, we contacted the organizations, letting them know about what happened. And in 1 week, we went from 30 vulnerable devices to none. And so for us, this is really important and shows the importance and the value of our spear warnings. Also because the only thing we can do is alert you and warn you, but ultimately we're really thankful to all these organizations who read our spear warning and took action really quickly. I added a couple other vulnerabilities on the slide. I think this is just a small highlight, because if you're looking at the amount of vulnerabilities we've been working for, I think we have over 28 campaigns already that happened in the first 3 months. But just to give you an idea of the sheer amount, that is above 5,000 spear warnings that have been sent by us to Belgian organizations specifically about vulnerabilities and vulnerable devices. Now, I know that we are going a little bit above schedule, and I apologize for that. So I'm just going to go quickly over the outlook. So what do we think is going to be happening in the very near future? And I don't think it's going to be any news if I tell anybody that geopolitics has a role. We all know that geopolitics is shifting, and it's shifting very quickly. But here we assess and that it is very likely that geopolitics and the way that it is being shaped today will represent a growing cyber threat for Belgium, but also for Europe in general. And that the cyber threat is going to be coming from different kinds of actors with different kinds of motivation. But ultimately, while you have different actors, we don't expect a major change in the types of threat actors. So what we mean is that we're still going to be targeted by state-sponsored actors, financially motivated groups, and hacktivists. Looking specifically at state-sponsored actors, we believe that they will remain a major concern and that they will still be trying to gather intelligence, but also to carry out espionage, including economic espionage, and also to try to destabilize critical infrastructure. That is something that is important for us to take into consideration, just the sheer aspect of destabilization and the focus on critical infrastructure. When it comes to financially motivated groups, we know that cybercrime is big business, and especially ransomware. So we also foresee here that financially motivated groups will continue to target Belgium, and likely that they will even more target Europe. Also partially because there is a possible chance that especially Russian-linked ransomware groups, due to geopolitics, might decide to target European organizations more than before. When it comes to hacktivism, even though it is the DDoS attacks are a periodic threat, we believe that hacktivism is a constant threat. We also have indications that would tend to suggest that governments do use hacktivist groups to advance their own state interests. And so that hacktivist groups are not just made of rebellious and engaged citizens, but that there is also a level of state influence there. And this is what we mean when we say it is also an extension of statecraft, is that hacktivism and the high kill actions that they carry out are additional mechanisms in order to exert pressure on political decisions. So if I had to summarize all of this in just one sentence, basically we could say that geopolitics is likely to represent a growing cyber threat for Belgium and Europe because it has an impact on the frequency, on the intensity, and also on the nature of cyber attacks. I know that it was a lot of information in a little bit of time. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them in the chat. I will be really happy to answer those throughout the rest of today's presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, Clara, thank you very much again for this presentation and providing some insights in the national and international cyber threat landscape. I think I can say that that it seems that cybersecurity experts won't be out of work anytime soon, but CCB is doing its utmost to support them in this and will continue to do so. Claro, thank you very much and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.